The city buzzed with the rhythm of late afternoon traffic. Los Angeles, a place where dreams clashed with reality, shimmered under the golden hues of the setting sun. The streets were alive with hurried pedestrians, neon signs flickering to life, and the distant hum of car engines filling the air. Leonardo DiCaprio had spent the day in meetings, discussing scripts, production schedules, and charity initiatives. It was the usual chaos of Hollywood, where every conversation revolved around money, fame, or power. By evening, he craved something real, something unscripted. Dressed in a simple hoodie, baseball cap, and worn-out sneakers, he maneuvered through the city unnoticed. He liked it that way. Fame was a double-edged sword. One moment, the world adored you. The next, it dissected your every move. Tonight, he just wanted to be another face in the crowd. Cutting through a nearly deserted parking lot behind a small grocery store, he heard a sound that made him pause. A rhythmic, strained clanking, the unmistakable sound of metal against asphalt. At first, he saw only the carts, rusty, uneven wheels screeching as they rolled forward. Then he saw her, an old woman, no less than 90, her frail body wrapped in layers of tattered clothing, was pushing an entire row of shopping carts toward the store's entrance. The effort seemed unbearable, her bony hands trembling, her back hunched, every step slow, yet determined. The carts were almost the size of her, and each push seemed to sap what little strength she had left. Leonardo stopped, his chest tightening. People walked past her, indifferent. A group of teenagers laughed in the distance. A man exited the store, scrolling through his phone. Nobody cared. Something inside him twisted. He took a step closer, then another. And then, the moment came. A voice, sharp, impatient, pierced through the air. "Hey, lady, you're blocking the entrance. Move it already." Leonardo's head snapped toward the voice. A store employee, barely in his 20s, stood with his arms crossed, irritation clear on his face. He wore the store's uniform, a neon vest hanging loosely over his frame, and an expression of pure annoyance. The old woman flinched, her hands gripping the handle of the cart tighter. Her lips moved slightly, but no words came out. She just nodded, as if she had learned long ago that arguing wasn't worth the effort. Leonardo clenched his jaw. She was 90 years old, pushing carts, alone, and now being yelled at. Something was very, very wrong here. He took another step forward. The employee huffed and turned away, muttering under his breath. But before he could walk off, a voice, low, steady, and unmistakably firm, cut through the tension. "You talk to her like that again, and we're going to have a serious problem." The employee froze. Slowly, he turned. Leonardo DiCaprio was standing there, hands in his pockets, staring right at him. The air shifted. The boy's face drained of color. The employee swallowed hard, his posture stiffening as he stared at the man in front of him. There was something about the way Leonardo stood, the way his gaze locked onto him without wavering, that made it impossible to ignore. The teenager's bravado flickered for a second, his fingers twitching by his sides, as if debating whether to respond or pretend he hadn't just spoken to the wrong person in the wrong way. His name tag glinted under the dim parking lot lights, the letters slightly faded, a sign of how little he cared for the uniform he wore. He shifted on his feet, glancing around as if hoping someone else would step in, but nobody did. Leonardo didn't move, didn't look away, didn't even blink. He wasn't trying to be intimidating, but he also wasn't going to back down. The old woman still clutched the carts, her fingers shaking, her breath uneven, her tired eyes flickering between them. She looked like she wanted to disappear, like she had been through this kind of treatment too many times to expect anything different. The moment stretched longer than it should have, silence pressing down between them until finally, the teenager scoffed and forced out a weak, unconvincing laugh. "Look, man, I didn't mean anything by it. She's just in the way. We've got a policy." Leonardo cut him off before he could finish. His voice was quiet, but it carried weight. "She's not in the way. She's working harder than you." The teenager opened his mouth, but for some reason, no words came. He glanced at the old woman again, maybe really looking at her for the first time, at her thin arms straining against the weight of the carts, at the way she stood with a determination that didn't match her fragile frame. The kid had probably spent his whole life treating people like her as background noise, just another inconvenience in his shift, never stopping to wonder why a woman this old would be doing a job like this in the first place. The old woman let out a shaky breath and took a step back, her hands slipping from the handle as if she didn't want to be the reason for any conflict. "It's fine, dear. I can manage," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Leonardo turned to her, and something in his expression softened just enough. "You shouldn't have to." She smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that reached the eyes. It was the kind of smile people gave when they had learned not to expect help. The employee shifted again, stuffing his hands into his pockets. "Look, I don't make the rules. She's been doing this for a while. If she didn't want to, she wouldn't, right?" He said it like it made sense, like it absolved him of any responsibility for how casually he had spoken to her. Leonardo exhaled sharply through his nose, biting back the first response that came to mind. He had spent enough time in places most people never saw, in countries where desperation looked exactly like this. People forced to do what their bodies could barely handle just to survive. He knew what it meant when someone said they had a choice, but didn't really. The words tasted bitter before he even spoke them. "How much do you get paid here?" The kid blinked, caught off guard by the sudden question. "I don't know, like 15 an hour or something?" Leonardo nodded slowly. "And her?" The teenager hesitated, his eyes darting to the old woman, as if realizing that, for all the months he had worked here, he had never actually thought about it. "I don't know. She's not on payroll. She just, does it." Leonardo's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking back to the old woman. "You're not an employee here?" She shook her head slowly. "No, dear. The manager lets me push the carts for a little money. Sometimes customers leave change in the carts, and I get to keep it. I don't mind." The words hit harder than they should have. She wasn't even getting paid. She was relying on scraps, on the kindness of strangers too hurried to take their coins back. It wasn't just exhausting work. It was humiliation disguised as an opportunity. Leonardo took a deep breath, dragging a hand over his face, forcing himself to stay calm, to not just react, to think. "And that's enough for food?" She let out a soft chuckle, the kind that didn't hold any amusement. "Most days." Something in Leonardo's chest burned. This was Los Angeles, a city where people spent a fortune on a single meal, where luxury cars lined the streets, where money flowed like water. But here, in the shadow of it all, a 90-year-old woman was pushing carts to afford food. He knew poverty. He had seen it around the world, in slums and villages where survival was a daily fight. But there was something about seeing it here, in a place that claimed to be full of opportunity, that made his stomach turn. He looked at the employee one last time. "Go inside." The kid hesitated like he wanted to argue, like he wanted to hold on to whatever weak sense of authority he thought he had. But Leonardo's expression made it clear there wasn't a debate to be had. The teenager huffed, muttered something under his breath, and turned away, pushing through the automatic doors and disappearing inside. Leonardo turned back to the old woman. "You're done for the night." She gave him a puzzled look. "Oh, don't worry, dear. I still have time before they close. I can still." "No," he said firmly, but not unkindly. "You're done." She hesitated, searching his face as if trying to understand why a stranger would care. "But..." Leonardo reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and without another word, held out a few crisp $100 bills. The woman's eyes widened, her hands trembling as she stared at the money. "I can't take that, dear. It's too much." He shook his head. "It's not enough, but it's a start." She looked at the money, then at him, and for the first time, her voice wavered. "Why would you do this?" Leonardo didn't answer right away. He didn't know how to explain it, how to put into words the way the world sometimes felt like it was built to break people like her, how unfair it was that she had to fight for something as basic as a meal, while others wasted fortunes on things they didn't even need. Finally, he just said, "Because someone should have done it a long time ago." She hesitated, then slowly reached out, taking the bills with hands that had worked too hard for too little. Her eyes shimmered, and for a moment, she looked like she didn't know whether to cry or just say thank you. Leonardo nodded toward the street. "Go home." She stared at him for a long time, then gave the smallest nod. Leonardo watched as she turned, clutching the money tightly, and walked away into the night. He wasn't finished. Not yet. Without another word, he turned toward the store, pushing through the doors. Someone needed to answer for this. The automatic doors slid open, and Leonardo stepped inside, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow over the aisles lined with neatly stacked products. The store was moderately busy, shoppers pushing carts filled with groceries, employees moving between shelves restocking items, the hum of quiet conversations blending with the occasional beep of cash registers. He moved with purpose, scanning the floor until his eyes landed on the customer service desk near the back, where a man in a buttoned-up shirt and a tie that looked too tight around his neck stood behind the counter, counting a stack of receipts. Leonardo approached without hesitation, planting his hands on the counter just hard enough for the man to glance up with mild annoyance. The employee looked at him, then did a double take, recognition flickering in his eyes, though he quickly masked it with indifference. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice carrying the same artificial politeness as someone who had been trained to deal with complaints but had long since stopped caring about them. Leonardo didn't bother with pleasantries. "Who's in charge?" The man raised an eyebrow, shifting his weight as if deciding how much patience he wanted to extend. "Depends on what you need. I need to speak to whoever's responsible for allowing a 90-year-old woman to push carts outside this store just so she can eat." A beat of silence followed, the employee's expression faltering before he forced out an awkward chuckle. "Oh, you must mean Ruth. She's not an employee. She just—" "I know," Leonardo interrupted, his voice steady but sharp. "She does it because she has no choice. And you let it happen." The employee glanced around, as if making sure no one else was paying attention before lowering his voice. "Look, I don't make the rules, all right? She's been doing that for years. It's not like we force her. She just shows up, takes the carts, and at the end of the day, the manager gives her a little something. It's not illegal." Leonardo's fingers curled against the counter, his patience wearing thin. "It's not illegal, but it sure as hell isn't right. She's 90. She can barely stand. And the best you can do is let her scrape together change from abandoned carts while your employees talk down to her." The man exhaled through his nose, looking increasingly uncomfortable, but still unwilling to engage beyond the bare minimum. "Sir, if you have a complaint, you're welcome to speak with the store manager. I just work the desk." "Then call the manager," Leonardo said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The employee hesitated, then sighed and picked up the phone, pressing a button before muttering something into the receiver. A few moments later, from a hallway near the back of the store, a man in his late 50s emerged, adjusting the collar of his uniform as he walked toward them. His steps were slow, deliberate, his expression already carrying the defensive stance of someone used to handling customer complaints. He had the look of a man who had spent too many years in retail, his thinning hair combed over in a way that didn't quite hide the bald spots, his gut pressing slightly against his belt. As he reached the counter, he offered a well-practiced, disingenuous smile. "I'm the store manager. What seems to be the problem?" Leonardo straightened, his eyes locking onto the man's. "The problem is Ruth." The manager's smile barely faltered, but there was a flicker of something behind his eyes, annoyance, maybe, or the realization that this conversation wasn't going to be an easy one. "Ruth? She's a sweet lady. What about her?" Leonardo let the silence hang for a second longer than necessary, letting the weight of his stare press into the man before speaking. "She shouldn't be pushing carts. She shouldn't be out there in the cold, struggling to move metal just to afford a meal. And you know it." The manager exhaled, shifting slightly, but he didn't break eye contact. "We don't force her to do anything. She chooses to. She's been doing it for years. If we didn't let her, she'd probably just go somewhere else. She's independent. She doesn't like handouts." Leonardo clenched his jaw, his patience stretching thinner by the second. "You call letting a 90-year-old woman work for scraps independence?" "She prefers it that way," the manager countered, his tone just defensive enough to reveal that he was aware of how wrong it sounded. "She's proud. She doesn't like charity." Leonardo shook his head. "She doesn't need charity. She needs dignity. She needs stability. And you, the guy in charge, stood back and watched this happen because it was easier than actually doing something about it." The manager crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. "Sir, this is a business. We have rules. We can't just put someone on payroll who isn't physically able to do the job. And we can't just start handing out money to everyone who needs it. That's not how the world works." Leonardo's voice dropped lower, his words slow and deliberate. "You're right. That's not how the world works. But it should be." The two men stared at each other, tension thick in the air, the store's usual background noise fading into a dull hum. A few nearby employees had stopped pretending not to listen, their gazes flickering between them with cautious curiosity. The manager let out a slow breath, rubbing a hand down his face before speaking again, his tone just a fraction softer. "Look, I don't have the power to fix the world. I can't make everyone's life easier. I have a store to run, employees to pay, a business to keep afloat. Ruth, she's been here longer than I have. She doesn't ask for much, and she doesn't want anyone feeling sorry for her." Leonardo studied him for a moment, considering his words, weighing the sincerity behind them. Then, after a long silence, he pulled out his wallet, grabbed a checkbook, and clicked open a pen. He didn't hesitate, didn't calculate, didn't overthink it. He wrote the number, signed his name, tore the check, and placed it on the counter between them. The manager glanced down, his eyes widening slightly at the amount. Leonardo spoke before he could react. "That should be enough to cover whatever she makes for the next year. And more." He tapped a finger on the counter. "She doesn't need to push carts anymore." The manager swallowed, his throat working as he processed the gesture, his gaze flicking between the check and Leonardo's unreadable expression. For a second, he looked like he wanted to argue, like he wanted to push back against the idea of a stranger coming in and changing things on a whim. But whatever resistance had been in his eyes slowly faded, replaced by something else, reluctant acceptance, maybe, or something close to shame. After a long pause, he nodded. "I'll make sure she gets it." Leonardo didn't thank him. He didn't need to. Without another word, he turned and walked away, back through the automatic doors, back into the night. But he wasn't done yet. There was still one more thing he had to do. Leonardo stepped outside into the cool night air, his hands shoved into the pockets of his hoodie, his mind still turning over the conversation inside. The store's bright lights flickered against the pavement, casting long shadows as cars continued to pull in and out of the lot. He had done what he could in there, but the uneasy feeling in his chest told him it wasn't enough. He had seen too many people like Ruth, too many lives that had been worn down by a system that didn't care, too many individuals left behind simply because no one bothered to stop and notice. The money would help, but it didn't fix the root of the problem, and that was what bothered him the most. He scanned the parking lot, searching for Ruth, but she was already gone. He hadn't expected her to linger, but something about the way she had looked at him before walking away stayed with him. He needed to know more. He needed to understand how someone like her, a woman who should have been resting in the comfort of a home, surrounded by family, had ended up here, pushing carts for spare change. Without a second thought, he pulled out his phone, typed the store's name into a search, and started scrolling through local community forums, news articles, anything that might give him a clue. It didn't take long to find what he was looking for. Her name wasn't just Ruth. It was Ruth Calloway. The name was buried in a small thread on a neighborhood forum, a post written by someone who had seen her at the store every day and had tried to help, but never knew how. There were scattered comments from people who had spoken to her, others who had offered money only to be turned down, and a few who had dug deeper into her past. She hadn't always been like this. 20 years ago, Ruth had owned a small diner, a place that had been in her family for generations. People wrote about it like it was a legend. Calloway's, the kind of place where everyone knew your name, where the coffee was always hot, and where Ruth herself had been the heart of it all. She had worked behind the counter, greeting every customer with the same warmth, serving meals to families, remembering orders without writing them down. People had loved her. The community had depended on her. But then, the story changed. Her husband had fallen ill. Medical bills had piled up. The diner, already struggling against the rise of big chain restaurants, couldn't keep up. She had taken out loans, tried to keep it afloat, but in the end, she had lost everything. Her home, her business, her savings. The only thing she had left was her pride, and that had kept her from asking for help, even when she had nowhere to go. Leonardo stared at the screen, the weight of her story pressing down on him. This wasn't just about money. This was about a woman who had given everything she had to a world that had taken it all and left her with nothing. And yet, even now, even after all of it, she still got up every morning, pushed those carts, and refused to let herself break. He looked up from his phone, his jaw tightening. He couldn't change the past. He couldn't undo what had been done. But there was something he could do. Without hesitation, he started walking toward his car. 15 minutes later, he pulled into a quiet neighborhood just outside the city. The houses here were smaller, older, tucked behind streets that most people didn't pay attention to. He checked the address twice before getting out, his footsteps quiet as he approached the modest, one-bedroom house that matched the description he had found online. The porch light was off, but he could see a faint glow from inside, a sign that someone was home. He knocked, then stepped back. A few seconds passed before he heard movement inside. The door creaked open just enough for Ruth to peer out, her eyes cautious until recognition flickered across her face. Leonardo. Her voice was softer than before, as if she still wasn't sure she was seeing him standing there. He gave her a small nod. "Can I come in?" She hesitated, glancing behind her before slowly pushing the door open wider. "I wasn't expecting visitors," she murmured, stepping aside to let him in. The house was exactly what he had imagined, small, sparse, but clean. The furniture was old but well kept, the walls bare except for a single framed photo near the kitchen, one of her and a man who must have been her husband, both of them smiling, looking younger, happier. There was no sign of luxury, no sign of comfort beyond the essentials. He took it all in silently before turning back to her. "I looked you up," he said simply, watching for her reaction. She sighed, shaking her head as she slowly lowered herself into a chair. "Didn't think anyone would bother." He sat across from her, leaning forward slightly. "Why didn't you tell me?" She let out a quiet laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Tell you what, dear? That I lost everything? That I used to have a life before all this? That I push carts because it's the only thing I can do that doesn't make me feel like I'm completely useless?" She shook her head again, her hands resting in her lap, fingers twisting slightly. "People don't want to hear those kinds of stories. They just want to feel sorry for you for a moment, then move on." "I don't," he said, his voice firm. "I don't want to feel sorry for you. I want to do something about it." She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "You already did. The money, it's more than I've had in years." "That's not enough," he said without hesitation. "You don't belong in that parking lot, Ruth. You don't belong scraping by when you should be enjoying your life. I know you don't want charity, so I won't offer it. But I have a proposal." She narrowed her eyes slightly. "What kind of proposal?" Leonardo took a deep breath. "Your diner. Calloway's. People still talk about it. They remember it. They miss it. What if I told you that you could have it back?" She blinked, caught off guard, her lips parting slightly before she shook her head. "That's impossible." "No, it's not," he said calmly. "I've helped rebuild restaurants before. I've worked with people who specialize in it. If you're willing, if you want it, I can help you reopen it. You run it, you call the shots, you take back what was yours. No handouts, just a second chance." For the first time since he had met her, Ruth looked like she didn't know what to say. Her hands gripped the edges of the chair, her breath uneven, her eyes searching his face as if trying to figure out if this was real. "You do that," she finally whispered. Leonardo nodded. "I don't just want to help you survive, Ruth. I want to help you live again." The silence stretched between them, thick with something unspoken. Then, slowly, she exhaled, a single tear slipping down her cheek before she wiped it away with a quick, almost embarrassed motion. "I don't know how to say yes," she admitted. Leonardo smiled, leaning back slightly. "Then don't. Just tell me when we start." She let out a shaky breath. Then, for the first time since he had met her, she smiled. A real one. And that was all the answer he needed. Ruth sat in silence, her fingers pressing lightly against the worn fabric of the chair as if grounding herself in reality. The words had been spoken, but they hadn't fully settled. The weight of them, the impossibility of what Leonardo had just offered, hovered in the air between them, daring her to believe it was real. Her entire life had been built on struggle, on making do with what little she had, on the painful acceptance that what was lost would never return. People like her didn't get second chances. They endured. They adapted. They survived. That was all. Leonardo watched her closely, giving her space to process what he had said. He could see the hesitation in her eyes, the way her hands clenched just slightly, as if holding onto the instinct to refuse. He had seen it before. The reluctance of people who had spent too long being let down, who had learned not to expect kindness without a cost. She finally spoke, her voice careful, measured. "You really think it's possible?" "I don't think," he said without hesitation. "I know." She exhaled slowly, shaking her head. "You don't understand, dear. It's not just about opening the doors again. That place was my life, but it's gone. The building, the equipment, the customers, everything that made it what it was, it's not there anymore. Then we rebuild it, Leonardo said simply. From the ground up, if we have to. She let out a quiet laugh, though it held more disbelief than amusement. And just like that, you think I can step back into the life I had 20 years ago? No, he admitted. But I think you can start something new. And I think you deserve to. Her eyes flickered toward the single-framed photo near the kitchen, the one of her and her husband in front of Calloway's, a time when everything had still made sense, when life had been about more than just getting through each day. She had spent so long accepting her reality that the idea of changing it felt almost absurd. But somewhere deep beneath the doubt, buried under years of struggle, there was something else, a small, fragile piece of her that wanted to believe it was possible. She looked at Leonardo again, searching his face for any sign that this was just another fleeting moment of sympathy, another empty promise meant to make someone else feel better. But there was no hesitation in his eyes, no trace of pity, just certainty. What would that even look like? She asked, her voice quieter now, as if she was afraid of getting too close to the idea. We start with the location, Leonardo said without missing a beat. We find a space, something manageable. Nothing too big, just enough to bring it back. We get the right people, the right resources. I know chefs, business developers, people who can make this happen. You wouldn't have to do it alone. Ruth shook her head, pressing her lips together. And what if I fail? Leonardo leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. Then you fail. But at least it's on your terms. At least you get to try. The words hit something inside her, something she hadn't let herself acknowledge in years. She had spent so long living in the shadow of her past, in the quiet acceptance that her best years were behind her, that she had never stopped to consider what it would mean to take control again. The fear was there, of course, but so was something else, something unfamiliar, something dangerous. Hope. She swallowed hard, her hands twisting together in her lap. I don't even know where to begin. That's why I'm here, Leonardo said simply. You don't have to figure it all out tonight. You just have to decide if you want this. She looked down at her hands, at the calluses that had formed from years of hard labor, at the lines that traced a lifetime of struggle. She had lived too long believing that this was all there was, that the world had moved on without her. But now, sitting across from someone who had no reason to care, no reason to be here, she found herself staring at a door she had thought was closed forever. For a long time, she said nothing. Then, finally, she nodded. I want this, she whispered. Leonardo smiled, the first real shift in the tension that had filled the room. Then we start tomorrow. The days that followed moved faster than Ruth could have ever imagined. Leonardo wasn't just serious, he was relentless. Within 24 hours, he had assembled a team, people who specialized in reviving old businesses, experts who knew how to take an idea and make it real. He found a small, empty cafe space in the heart of the city, nothing extravagant, just enough to start fresh. Ruth had expected to feel overwhelmed, to find a reason to back out, but somehow, she didn't. Every step forward felt like waking up from a long, exhausting dream. When they visited the new location, she ran her fingers over the counters, feeling the smooth surface beneath her palms. It wasn't Calloway's. It never would be. But it could be something else. Something hers. As the plans took shape, the community began to take notice. Word spread quickly. People who had once eaten at her diner, people who remembered the warmth of it, the food, the kindness that had defined it. They came forward, offering to help, sharing memories, promising to return once the doors reopened. It was a quiet, powerful reminder that she had never really been forgotten. The opening day came faster than she was ready for. The morning was crisp, the air filled with the scent of freshly brewed coffee and warm bread. A small crowd had gathered outside, waiting for the doors to open, faces both familiar and new. Ruth stood inside, her hands pressed against the edge of the counter, steadying herself. Leonardo stood beside her, watching her carefully. Nervous. She let out a slow breath. Terrified. He chuckled. Good. That means you're alive. She looked at him, at the man who had walked into her life when she had least expected it, who had seen something in her that she had forgotten existed. She nodded once, then stepped forward. When she turned the sign to open, the door swung inward almost immediately. The first customer stepped in, a man in his 60s, his eyes lighting up as he took in the space. "I never thought I'd see Calloways again," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Ruth smiled, steady and sure for the first time in years. "Neither did I." As the cafe filled, as the sound of conversation and laughter grew, as she moved behind the counter, taking orders, greeting people, working, she realized something she hadn't understood until this moment. This wasn't about going back. This was about starting over. And for the first time in a long, long time, she was finally ready.